Hey, I'm James. Welcome to Game Stories, where we write games that tell stories. And in this episode, we are talking about how to do RS well. We've sort of done some videos covering the technical details of how to put things in a game and make it so you can walk around town and click on them, how to do dialogues and items, and try to set up dialogues so that players have to kind of visit someone and then get a quest to go somewhere else. Now we're going to cover a couple of principles that you kind of need to keep in mind when you're shooting for designing a good example of a location-based story game. Let me just pull it up really quick. What do we want to do? This and then, yeah. All right, so there's two principles that I feel like should guide your design efforts with location-based games. There's probably more principles, and take this advice with a grain of salt. There's probably ways to violate these principles in ways that are interesting. But for general purposes, I think these are some good things to think about. And they are, as you can read, motivation and location. What I mean by this is if you are going to create a game story where I have to physically walk across town to interact with the next piece of the narrative, then you need to motivate me to do that. I'm not just going to do that because you made a game. I'm going to do that because you made the game engaging and interesting and compelling enough to actually get me to get up and walk across town. And that's not an easy task, right? To get any player to sort of do something out of the ordinary for themselves. That's a tough challenge. So we're going to look at some ways that maybe you can cope with player motivation. And the second is location, which is sort of related but is distinct enough that if you're going to make me walk across town to the corner of First and Main, then the corner of First and Main needs to matter in some way. If the same narrative information could have been given to me much closer to my couch, then why should I bother walking across town? When I go there and I get there and I interact with the physical space, I should feel like being in that space matters both to the game and to the story and to my whole experience of the thing. So paying very close attention to how your locations are meshed with the game narrative is a really important thing to keep in mind when you're designing these. So let's look at these in a little more detail. So when thinking about player motivation, there's a few ways I think you can try to adjust your design to meet players halfway. And one of them is to set your story in what I call low motivation locations. In other words, instead of putting all the points in your map in hard to get to places or in places that I probably am not going to go on my own, put them in places where I probably am already going to go, right? If your game is targeted at visitors to your town, tourists who are going to be exploring your town, then put the locations in the places where they're probably going to go anyway, right? Put it at the Capitol building and the art museum and the college campus or whatever it is that they're coming to see. You know, the main street with all the shops and stuff. Put it in the places where they're probably going to end up. And then they don't need to be quite as motivated, right, to get to those places because they're kind of already there. If you're targeting kind of a commuter audience who's just going to kind of play randomly on their phone, put the major locations along the major transportation routes. If you got to, put them along the bus routes so that people just ride the bus and play your game, right? Learn about the story. So low motivation locations is one way to cope with that. The other one, I think, which is important anyway, is clear goals. If I'm going to walk to that spot, I need to know why I'm going there. Not just why as a human being, but why my character might want to go there, right? What part of the story are we trying to solve? What am I going to accomplish by getting to that next place? So if Mr. Elephant sends me on a quest, I need to know why I'm going on that quest and what will be accomplished. I might not know all of the mysteries behind it, but I need to have enough to get me out the door and moving in that direction. right? Characters we care about, this is an important part of like any narrative, and certainly any narrative game. But I think in here it matters even more, because if I'm invested in my player character, or even in the fate of some non-player characters, I feel like I know them and I want the best for them, and I can see that they're in some kind of trouble that maybe my actions can prevent or solve, then that might be just enough to get me to go to this out of the way place and maybe solve that problem, right? Caring about people and intervening on their behalf in the story world, and maybe solving their problems in ways that I probably can't for my real life friends, right? Genres bring with them, and here I'm thinking of like mystery, adventure, romance, and so forth, science fiction or whatever. These different kinds of storytelling bring with them their own sets of motivation. So, for example, if you give me a mystery story, then baked into that is this motivation for me to get to the end and figure out what happened. So I'm going to be motivated to visit the crime scene, the police department, the apartment of the suspect, the whatever else you're throwing into the game. I'm going to be motivated to go to those locations if you give me a mystery that's compelling enough of a question for me to want to solve. Adventure is the same way. There's some kind of big problem, and I know that going to whatever location to solve whatever thing is going to solve that problem, especially if there's characters I care about who are affected by the big problem, then I'm going to want to go on that adventure. And then something like romance too, if the main tension is about sort of interpersonal issues and complications, and you have situations where if I go to the movie theater, then I might be able to see so-and-so, then that might be enough motivation to get people going places, right? Another piece is that when I actually get there and I'm clicking on the thing, what I get from clicking should be a sort of intrinsic reward of its own, right? It should be cute or funny or informative or something. There's some kind of payoff to clicking that button. That is, yes, it's narrative, and yes, it advances the narrative, and yes, it's gamey, so it has some kind of currency or item or something I get out of it, but also just looking at the picture or interacting with the dialogue, there's something in that is cute or funny or teaches me something about the place where I am. And for sure, I think it should do that. We'll talk about that in a minute. Another way to do this is player-to-player social motivation, and I mostly put this on the list because, let's go over here. I'm not going to talk in depth about this, but the two location-based games that have kind of made any name for themselves are both by Niantic is the name of the studio, and they made Ingress, and they also made Pokemon Go. So Pokemon Go does this cute things principle really, really well. Why am I going to the park? Because I want to catch Pikachu, and Pikachu is cute. When I go and I see the thing and I click on it, I get this little interaction with the Pokemon character, right? Not a lot of story there, but there is some interesting sort of crowd dynamics and social dynamics that happen. The game they made before Pokemon Go did sort of team-based play to a much greater degree than Pokemon Go does. In Ingress, there were sort of, and I believe it's still going on, there were narratives around your team trying to fight the other team, and you would coordinate with actual players to be at a particular place at a particular time so that the 3 or 4 of you could accomplish a goal, could lock down some territory or something, or unlock some territory. And so you would have this, what I'm calling player-to-player social motivation, meaning real people are who are engaged in this game are texting me or emailing me or communicating with me through the game to say, hey, let's accomplish this thing together. And that's a reward and a motivation of its own, right? Those are some ways. That's not the limit of ways to motivate people to get places. And your game certainly does not have to do all of these, but your game does have to do something to get people off of their butts and walking around and interacting with locations. And it needs to be more than just, hey, I made a game. It needs to be, here's some rewards, here's some motivations for you, here's some, like, let me make it easy for you. or some sort of something, narrative structure or something that gets me, that pushes me and makes me interested in going to the next piece of your story. Location, I've already said how location matters, but briefly, if I go to a spot, that physical place in the real world should matter both to the story, or to the story, basically. The narrative world shouldn't be completely divorced from the real world, otherwise why bother walking around, right? So there's at least 3 ways to accomplish that. One is to set your game in the here and now, meaning your story world is our real world, and you are asking players to go interact with the real world in ways that they might not in their normal lives, but might still be interesting to them. So, I don't know, some sort of social commentary about the place you live in, picking out particular points of interest within that social commentary could be a very productive and interesting way to make locations matter. So, big issue in the United States has been officer shootings of civilians, and so maybe, you know, making the location of one of those shootings matter in your game, and sort of the investigative work and the protests locations and the reporter responses and et cetera, building all of that into a game that people can walk around and see that recent history or current events even, could be a cool way to get people to think about the space where they live differently, right? Another way to do that is, instead of setting it in the current time, is to wind the clock back and give people, you know, film or pictures or audio or historical details about the place where you are, but in the past. So, you know, put the game in 1910, your town, and have players interact with some sort of story that happened then. And suddenly there's a layer of interest to, and a reason for being in a particular location, right? We're at the corner of First and Main because that's where this thing happened in 1910, and here's a picture of it, right? That makes the place matter. If you're inventing a world, I would recommend inventing a kind of world that I would call, or I'm forgetting his name, but I did a video about world building, and one of the scholars talked about overlaid worlds, meaning there's the real world and then there's a little bit of fantasy slapped on top. It's not a completely fantastical universe that is totally divorced from our world. There's points of intersection, right? And one way to do that is to set your game in the future. And meaning, instead of winding the clock back, you wind it forward and say, in 10 years or 20 years or 100 years, this is what's going on in this town. And these are the problems that we're facing. And this particular place, First and Main, is being used for this purpose in our world. If you're going to do that, so let's say if you create some sort of post-apocalyptic setting, and you say the First and Main is some kind of survivor camp that's been set up, there needs to be a logical reason why that location would be used for that in the future. Players should be able to go there and imagine the world that way and think, yeah, that makes sense. I would use this area for that too, right? They shouldn't just go there and think, that's weird. Why do they set things up here? There should be a kind of a logic that informs the way the future citizens have repurposed the environment, so that players can sort of feel like they're a part of that world, even though they're not, right? Another kind of overlaid world that can work is what I call Here and Now Plus, meaning it's just our world, but there's this extra twist. There's Here and Now Plus superheroes, Here and Now Plus vampires or zombies or aliens from outer space or conspiracy theory or whatever it is that you want to fill in that blank with. You add some kind of fantastical element to the actual world that we live in, and then you reimagine the social order and the spaces in your game based on that additional thing. So if there's superheroes or zombies, if there's zombies, Where are people hiding? Where is the outbreak coming from? What are the most important locations in your town for survival? How are they guarded or avoided by people, right? And you start thinking through the space. So when a player goes to a particular place in your town, they get the narrative logic of the world and can see, just like in the post-apocalyptic setting, they can see the logic of why this space is used in that way. Why the blood bank happens to be a place where lots of vampires are hanging out. That makes sense, right? Okay, so that's the end of my notes. Quick wrap up is just when you're designing these games, make sure you've got some way of making it matter to players where they go. Make the location matter. Give them a story world that interacts with the physical locations that they have to get to. And then give them a reason to get moving around to those locations. Give them quests or give them story reasons. Give them characters they care about. Give them, make it easy for them if they're, don't want to go too far out of the way, or if they do have to go far out of the way, make sure that there is a good push to get them going in that direction. Okay? There's probably more to cover here, but these are two pretty good basics for thinking about how am I going to make this story work in this space. Okay, that's it for this time, and probably that's it for RS for now. So we'll start something new next time. Thanks for watching.